Hi guys. In this video we're going to talk about tempo changes, specifically doing mashups where you need to slow down in the middle. This is to allow you to go from a dance tempo to something more like R&B or rock music, which may be at a slower BPM. Under normal circumstances, we try to keep the tempo the same during a mashup, but sometimes the style of music you're trying to mix into is so different that the music loses all its power if it's brought up in speed. Choosing to do a mashup that slows down in the middle puts us at a disadvantage because the change in energy is already going to be working against us. So we usually have to use all the techniques we've used so far just to help us transition smoothly into a slower break. Let's have a look at an example pairing of tracks and see why they're going to be so difficult. Here we have Down to Business, one of the tracks that we've been using as a main track in other examples. It plays at 126 BPM. The breakdown track we want to transition into is only 96 BPM. Here it is playing at its natural speed. It is in the right key, so we're off to a good start. But if we find the pieces of the tracks that we want to use and place them on the timeline, we're going to run into problems when we try and play them because the breakdown track is going to try and play up at 126 BPM. Let's see what this sounds like. While it still sounds pretty cool, it's come up a lot in speed, and it has a completely different feel now. It also feels quite rushed. It's starting to sound more like a breaks track than a hip-hop track. This would be even more devastating if the track was a radio song with well-known lyrics, because the lyrics would move so fast people wouldn't be able to sing along. Let's see what it sounds like when we do an abrupt change in tempo to suit the new breakdown. The change in speed is far too sudden. If you played something like this on a dance floor, it doesn't matter what kind of effects or tricks you use to try and hide the edit or to lead up to the breakdown track, people are going to get disoriented really quickly. Alternatively, we could try putting a 2-bar gap in between the sections. This is an idea that could potentially work, and we'll come back to it later on, because it'll give the listeners a chance for their internal metronome to reset. But we're going to have to use some trickery as we cut one off and start the other. Otherwise, it'll just sound like a mistake. Have a listen. Firstly, let's choose not to use a gap and have one track roll straight out of the other. We'll move the breakdown track to the start of the breakdown and start using the techniques that we've learnt before to try and make it work. We've previously learnt that a great way to prepare the listener for a new element coming in is to give them a taste of the sonics and even a little bit of the melody in the lead up to the point where it comes in full. So let's prepare an audio track to set up as a hinting track, which we will use to slowly introduce the breakdown theme. As you copy a piece over to the main track section of the arrangement, double check your warp settings to make sure they're going to be the best for the new tempo. After all, this element's now going to be playing at dance music tempo, which is a lot faster. Have a look through the breakdown element until you can find a nice, clean, simple part to use. We're pretty lucky in this case because there's a small vocal sample that is prominent through the whole track, and it appears on its own at the very end of the song. So we'll grab that. As we should do with all hinting loops, we'll make sure the section we're using is simple enough, and then we'll either pull it back in volume, pull it back in bass level, or do some subtle filtering in so that it doesn't take up too much attention. In this example, we're using some bass balance reduction combined with a low pass filter to slowly bring it in over the 8. By the time you get to the end of the 8, it feels like the mashup intends to go into a breakdown. So that's one way we're going to be able to get the listener to go along with the change. Now that we're starting to hear what it's going to sound like, it's become a bit more obvious to the ear that the breakdown track is still too slow to match the energy of the main track. We could make it quite a bit faster without destroying the integrity of the track. So let's bring it up a little closer to dance music tempo and try and find a good balance between the integrity of the original song and a reduction in that energy jump. This is not something that you can do mathematically looking at the numbers that represent the BPM. This really has to be something that you do by feel. In fact, it's better to do it on your speakers rather than on headphones because you feel the difference in energy much better when you're listening out loud. The dance floor will feel that difference 10 times as much, so you have to make sure that the balance is just right. Let's also choose this moment to draw our envelope for the song tempo. Rather than have the BPM change instantly, let's have it slowly drop towards the tempo around 4 bars beforehand. As the dance music track starts to slow down, this will be a cue for the audience to expect something to happen. When you do this, don't forget to splice off the piece of the main track that you want to use so that you can enable warp and it will follow the session tempo as it slows down. We can also start the breakdown a little faster than we intend it to be and take a couple of bars to settle. Now that we've done some hinting towards the breakdown track, we want to do some linking from the main track and have a little bit of it continue through the breakdown just to glue it all together. You're probably starting to see a pattern here. Rather than overtly using a couple of techniques, we're subtly using quite a few different techniques to build towards this smooth transition. If you've set your main track up correctly, you won't have any warping on it, so it will play without any weird audio artifacts. So make sure when you slice a piece off to use in the breakdown, you select that part of the clip and turn warping on. Remember also to choose an appropriate warp mode, keeping in mind that it's going to tempo change quite a lot more than normal. Therefore, you might need tighter beat intervals, such as 1/8 or 1/16. In this example, I originally tried using quite a melodic section as my linking piece. But as you'll hear, the notes in it started to clash with what was going on in the breakdown. Be very cautious of this because you don't want to confuse the listener with too many conflicting sounds or melodies. I'll see if I can improve things by pulling the bass levels out and pulling the volume back a bit. But you can hear it doesn't really help. The notes in the section that I've used are clashing too badly, even when the bass balance is pulled right back. You can hear that I have to pull it back so far that it barely serves any purpose at all. So at least to begin with, I want to start with a much simpler section to use as a linking piece. So I've gone to the intro to find another simpler piece that just has some claps and some hats in it. At this point, I'm slicing and moving so many short clips around that I decide that it's easier to handle the automation if it isn't copied and moved with the clips. You can change whether automation is moved with clips or not by clicking the lock icon at the top right corner of the arrangement window. It doesn't do a lot, but it does provide a little bit of that rhythmic energy that came out of the main track. We can use the busier melody part later as a pickup. Okay, that's about all the linking and hinting we can do for now, so let's try some effects. If we place a boom as well as a white noise downshifter at the start of the breakdown, that should create some impact and excitement, which will distract the listener from the change in energy, as well as let them know that something important is happening at that moment. This will make their ears a little more forgiving of what's going on. We'll also find a white noise upsweeper in preparation for the moment where we need to start transitioning back and increasing the speed again. At this point, remember to use samples that fit with the genre that you're working with. Again, the transition is just a little bit smoother than it was before. We've used hinting, linking, a subtle slowdown, and samples by this point. Let's look at another technique. Previously, we learnt about using return tracks, where we send a little bit of audio from somewhere to an effect, like a reverb or a delay. This allows us to hide very sudden edits, just like the ones we've got here. Previously, we found that using a delay was a great choice because it carries the rhythm of an element that's being dropped out on into the breakdown. However, in this case, we don't want to keep the rhythm going. We actually want to start hiding the rhythm from the listener so that we can adjust them to the new tempo. So we won't be using a delay. Instead, we'll be using our long reverb return. Because the lengths of reverbs are based on a duration of time and have nothing to do with rhythm, they mask a tempo change quite well. Delays, on the other hand, are effects we set up to intentionally hit in sync with the rhythm of the mashup. So when we use them over a tempo change, the delay device will do one of the following things, depending on the plugin you use. Either the delay effect will continue at the same speed over the tempo change, resulting in delays that are completely out of time, or the device will respond to the tempo change and spread the audio samples out to fit the new tempo, and the delays that are already triggered will change pitch rapidly, which will sound terrible. Or, in some cases, the plugin will reset every time it receives a new tempo value from the session, meaning that the delays will get suddenly cut off or turn into pretty nasty sounding audio glitches. So stick with the reverb during this kind of transition. You'll notice that with the right kind of boom underneath, sending your main track to a big reverb will sound quite natural. Now that the beginning of the break is starting to sound a lot smoother, let's have a look at the end. If we do what we normally do and try to use the final 8 bars of the main track as a way of getting out of the break, we want to do the reverse of what we did when we came into the break, and use that 8-bar build section as a time to slowly bring the tempo back up to dance music speed. This is another one of those things that you'll really have to do by feel. You can't necessarily draw a straight line of automation for the song tempo in the final 8 of the break. Often it feels better to start speeding up a lot quicker and then backing off towards the end. Again, I recommend you do this on speakers rather than headphones, as you'll feel it a lot more. In this case, the chord progression of the breakdown track moves around over the space of every 2-bar loop, whereas the 8-bar build in the main track stays on the same chord, on the tonic. This creates a bit of harmonic clashing. Have a listen and see if you can see what I mean. The elements are going to work together much better if we can loop a section of the breakdown track that sits on the tonic. Listen closely to how the two elements work together. I decided in this case that they weren't quite working together because the main track's build section was using heaps of snare and clap energy to build up, whereas the breakdown track was using lots of kick drum, which prevents it from feeling like a build. So I've taken a section where it uses a snare and just looped that. Then I've grabbed the original vocal sample as our way of tying it to the breakdown melody, and I've put this on our linking track. Now you can hear there's no kick drum coming from the breakdown track, preventing it from sounding like a build. The keys are unified. Sometimes you'll have to do these kinds of tricks, almost creating your own section out of the breakdown track in order to make sure that they fulfill the purpose of the build section. In regards to the main track, you want to check your warp settings during the build and make sure that they're appropriately set. Towards the beginning of the build, when the main track is being heavily tempo adjusted, you want the beat splice intervals to be very narrow, usually 1/16. But by the time they get to the end, they can be 1/8 or 1/4. Once the session is back up at full dance tempo, the main track shouldn't have to be warped at all. From here, you apply all the techniques that you usually would. Bass balancing, volume automation, and filtering to make sure that they blend from one element to the other nice and smoothly. In this case, I can hear there's a dropout in energy as it goes into the build section. And there's not much I can do about it at the moment because of the sections of the breakdown track that I've used. I'm going to try and make this a little bit better by high passing up into the 8 a little bit. This means there won't be such a drop in bass levels when it enters the 8. Of course, the other thing I can do to help the dropout in bass energy here is to simply place another boom at the beginning of the 8. This will help quite a lot, as will the upsweeping white noise that goes into that 8. A white noise downshifter can also help to add a bit more excitement during the 8. It's also worth trying to create a cool moment out of the breakdown track to use in the very last bar of the build, just as a final sign-off before it kicks into the drop. In this case, I had a look through the breakdown track to try and find an appropriate moment, but wasn't able to find one. But that's fine, because every mashup is a little bit different. It just depends on the parts you've got in front of you. Now, I want to show you the other option that we talked about right near the beginning of the video. At the beginning of the break, rather than having the main track flow straight into the break, we can have the main track build up and drop into a boom, leaving a couple of bars of silence and then beginning the breakdown track. This is a common trick in dance music generally. In a way, it can create more drama as well. Let's have a look at what we would do if we were going to do that with this mashup. You can select a couple of bars in the arrangement and go up to Edit and click Duplicate Time. It will duplicate those 2 bars in the arrangement and push everything else along. It does this across every track and moves your automation along with the clips. The primary purpose for this is obviously if we wanted to double a section, but it's handy because we can use it to insert a couple of bars and then just delete everything out of them. In this case, I'm deleting all the clips from the main track and the break elements, but I'm moving the boom and the white noise into that space, so that when the main track builds up, it simply drops straight into those samples. Then, 2 bars later, the breakdown track will come in. Let's have a listen to what this would sound like. As you can hear, the reverb send that we originally automated in for the last technique works perfectly here. The tone, energy, and key information of the main track carries out into those 2 bars in the form of reverb. There's also power in the bottom end, thanks to the boom, and some excitement and intensity carrying into the break, thanks to the white noise sample. The only thing left needed to smooth this over is a reverse reverb into the break track. So we select a short section, usually just a beat or half a beat, copy it to the end of the arrangement, pop it on its own track and create a reverse reverb out of it using the technique that we've seen previously. Now we pop it into that 2-bar gap so that it feels like the breakdown track sucks into existence. Let's have a listen to how it sounds. Unlike a slowdown mashup where the main track moves straight into the breakdown, a mashup with a 2-bar gap doesn't require as much of a careful slowdown towards the break. So let's make a little change to our automation and see how it sounds. So there we have it. It definitely takes a lot of work, but you can see how using quite a few different techniques, just a little bit, add up to create a more smooth transition into a slower tempo. And the same thing goes for getting out of that tempo back up to full speed. This theory is quite opposite to regular mashups, where you want to try and use as few techniques as possible to make it work. But they are alike in one important way. If you pick the right tracks to begin with, you'll have a much easier time of making them work together. Even if you're using tracks that have quite different tempos, use tracks that have quite similar sounds and personalities. For instance, your pairing is going to be a lot easier to work with if you're using an emotional dance track paired with an emotional song in the breakdown, or a real chunky down-to-business dance track with a cool slower tempo track like a hip-hop track. In the next and final video, we'll look at finishing your mashup. That is, how to know when it's finished and how to export it. Thanks for watching.